the pleasure to have Professor Claude Menard. He's going to talk about one subject that we had a plenary session yesterday. And at the end of the plenary session, we had several very interesting comments and questions from the audience. And so now we have an opportunity to get deep in this subject. And so please, Claude, you have the floor.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be here again with this group and to interact with you all. In doing so, I have three problems. The first one is that I have to compete with Antonio. So that's why I have a suit and a tie, because he got his suit and tie out of his luggage yesterday morning. So I have to be at the same level, at least. The second problem is that I don't know anything about football. So I cannot introduce a slide with football players, pictures, and all that. You know, I could introduce hockey players, but for Brazilians, it doesn't make sense. And the third problem is that we've had very nice and interesting presentations so far that were mostly oriented towards the big picture. And I'm going to focus on apparently what is a small picture, okay? Because I'm going to focus on the problem of organization theory, and more at the micro level than the macro picture. But I think one important contribution beside what Bernardo mentioned before of the so-called new institutional approach or the introduction of these new ideas has been that they not only focus on institutions, but also on organizations and what are the links between these two levels. And there's still a lot to do to understand how they interact. Through regulation, through the political and judiciary system and so forth, but I think that the focus on these issues is something that is a nice contribution. So I'm going to look at that from the micro point of view, so to speak. My topic is about plural forms of organization, and it's something that is related to an ongoing project. So I'm not presenting something that is achieved and a paper ready to publish or whatever. It's more exploring something to try to understand better these plural forms of organization. And I thought that this workshop was a perfect opportunity to present that and to help us developing our project. And I will mention in a few minutes who the us are. Okay, so let me start with a very short review or survey of the history and organization theory of what I consider to be three major steps. There was a lot of publications about organizations in the late 1950s and early 1960s already, but they were mostly in sociology, very few in management, very few in economics. And it's only basically after the famous papers by Coase. Well, the nature of the firm was published early, but it really had an impact late in the 70s, and then the contribution of Williamson, that the economists started getting interested in organization theory and started interacting also with people who have worked on these issues in sociology or management sciences. And the initial step was the one that relates Williamson to Coase, which was why do we have firms? And if we have both markets and organizations that we call firms that are organizing a lot of activities without going through the market, what are the rules for the trade-off? You're all familiar with that first step, which I think is an important one because it introduced in the economic literature, and it continues to be a source of analysis, the mystery of vertical integration. You know, what are the factors that are pushing firms to integrate some activities and not other, or to disintegrate, to externalize activities that they were doing previously? That was the first step. I think there's an important second step, which is much more recent, which is the extension of this trade-off, this initial trade-off between firms and markets, to a third class of organizations that are identified with different names. The one that has been prevailing, particularly in organization theory and particularly among people in the tradition of Coase and Williamson, is hybrids. The term hybrids was initially introduced, it's an interesting thing, it was introduced by Paul Rubin in a paper from 1978 on franchising. Well, the paper was not focusing exclusively on franchising, but used franchising as the typical example of these mode of organization that you cannot classify as integrated firms, but still they're there, right? So how do you explain that? And Williamson, who initially was a bit skeptical about the role of these type of organization, in 1975 he argued that they were probably unstable and transitory, progressively changed his mind, and in a paper that has been quite influential in organization theory, the paper from initially published in 1991, then revised and introduced in his book from 1996, he identified that as the hybrid arrangements, a family of arrangement that would be distinct from markets and organizations and sort of in between, but without qualifying very much what are their main characteristics. But that was a second step, which is basically about the mystery of inter-firm cooperation, right? How is it that firms can cooperate and at the same time they are competing on the same market, for example? And then there's a third step, which is the emergence of a set of puzzling issues that we now call the plural forms. So basically we have three main puzzles. Antonio introduced the idea of puzzles yesterday. Economists like puzzles, and I think it's a good way to approach, problems and to see what are the issues at stake. And we have basically three puzzles in organization theory that are more or less developed, more or less solved. The first one is if you look at the industry level, in a certain sector of activity, let's say the agri-food industry or distribution of consumption goods and so forth, at that level, that general level, you have a first puzzle, which is why are different modes of governance often adopted for organizing similar or identical transactions? Why is it that in the car-making industry, you have some firms like General Motors that basically decided to integrate most of their inputs, while another firm using basically the same technology, producing very similar products, Toyota, has decided to outsource systematically. Okay? That's the first puzzle, which is at a very general level, and we have now a lot of literature on this issue. There's a second puzzle, which is about the inter-firm agreements at that level, and which is based on the idea of, well, between markets and outsourcing on the market or integrating like General Motors versus Toyota. There's a lot of intermediary forms, the hybrids that I've mentioned before, but that raises a puzzle. How do we explain the persistence in the long run of organizational arrangements in which the allocation of rights is often blurred? Both the decision rights, think about strategic alliances, for example, where you're sharing some property rights, you're sharing some decision rights, and at the same time you're competitors. Okay? How can that be stable over time, or in the pharmaceutical industry as well? So that's a second puzzle. There's still some literature on that, less developed than the previous one, and it's still not obvious, why is it that these forms can persist over time? And that raises all the issue of the mode of governance that can monitor these arrangements. What are the structures that are implemented? There were some papers presented here in different sessions about these issues. What's the kind of authority that can be developed? It's not hierarchy because it's not within an integrated firm, but at the same time you need to coordinate tightly, but you coordinate only part of the activities among other people. Emmanuel and I have worked quite a lot, and we even I presented a paper last year on our ongoing project on this issue. Okay, that's a second puzzle, and we still need theoretical development to understand that better. There's a third puzzle, though, which is why is it that firms that benefit from integration, otherwise there would be no firm, right? So they benefit clearly from integration, but at the same time, they rely on outsiders for a certain part of their transactions. Okay? Think of it, this has been mentioned already in the now classical paper on vertical integration by Monteverde and Thies in 1982, where they focused on why is it that General Motors integrate more than Ford, what are the characteristics of the transaction that can explain vertical integration, and sort of en passant, they mention that, well, by integration, we mean a firm that does organize its inputs at least at a level of 80%. Fine. It means that there's 20% that is outsourced. Why is it that a firm that thinks that it's profitable to integrate 80% of the activity decides to outsource 20%? And typically, that's a question that relates to plural forms, right? So that's how, but this problem was not, I mean, there was no emphasis on that issue in the Monteverde and Thies paper, and then most of the papers after that were focusing on factors that are explaining vertical integration or not, or outsourcing. That was a trade-off, but not why the same firm or the same organization would choose different forms simultaneously. It's only the 1990s with the initial papers that have been mentioned yesterday, for example, by Braddock and other, that this idea in franchising initially, and then progressively we realized that it exists in other activities as well, that the dual distribution, for example, in franchising, well, you have plural forms simultaneously, at least two forms. Okay, so basically, my presentation is focusing on this third puzzle. I'm not going to talk about the first two, okay? Because I really want to focus on this puzzle, which you can also express in another way, vice versa. Why is it that if there are comparative advantages for a firm to outsource, that this firm maintains part of the same transaction in-house, which is exactly the symmetrical question than the previous one, okay? But putting the emphasis on things that are a bit different. By plural forms here, let me make it clear what I mean by that. I mean those, and we mean, I think, yeah, that's another thing that I should have mentioned from the very beginning. I'm going to mention the people who are associated to the project. I didn't submit my paper to them. They don't know what I'm going to talk about, so I say we, but the we is conditional to their approval, which I'm going to Sao Paulo right after this conference to work on the project, okay? So, and I did mostly the theoretical work on the theoretical framework to complete the empirical part, but we still have to discuss the model that I'm going to introduce. They may totally disagree, so we may be I, but we will see, okay? Okay, so, but that part at least we agreed when we submitted the project to the CNRS in France and FAPESP here, then we agreed that what we were going to talk about is that we're going to try to examine these organizational arrangements in which for the same class of transactions and within the same institutional and competitive environment. So we make these variables stable, okay? We don't want to look at too many different things at the same time. So in the same institutional and competitive environment, a party uses simultaneously different modes of governance and relies simultaneously on substantially different types of contracts. Okay? So that's how we define plural forms in our project. So as I mentioned, it's an ongoing project. It's a joint venture with Vivian, Emmanuel, Sylvia, and Roberta de Sousa. Okay? And it's an ongoing project, so all comments will be most welcome. I'm mostly focusing here on the theoretical side. I will propose a theoretical framework that try to capture that problem, and that could be the support of our empirical analysis. Now, we all know that in joint ventures, strategic alliances, and so forth, there are problems of coordination, even when cooperation is agreed upon. So we're cooperating on this project, but we may disagree on the model, as I've mentioned, because this model has not been discussed nor approved by the team, okay? Okay, so this is what I'm going to develop. The introduction, I've done that already. I will make a quick review of the existing explanations. Many of you are familiar with these explanations, but I would like to list these explanations at least so that you will have a picture of the variety of explanations that we find in the literature. I will not spend time giving the references. I will just give the core elements of these explanations in my view. Then my framework, and a few words on the methodology, but the key point is really the third one. That's the one I want to emphasize here. Okay, the existing explanations to plural forms of organization, well, it's a relatively recent literature. Basically, it's over the last 15 years that these issues have been introduced in the literature, actually very slowly in the 1990s, and there's a little more available over the last years, but we don't know yet that much about that. But there are still, even if it's relatively recent, there are several candidates as explanation. And my point is that they're mostly providing interesting views, but very partial views of the phenomenon, and often lacking a theoretical foundation, which is a limit. So before I look at these different explanations, let me make it clear that I don't think that we should discard these explanations, but we have to try to integrate that in a more unified theoretical framework, which is what I will try to do today. Okay? Okay, so let's start that list. It may be a bit boring to look at a list of possible explanations, but I think it's worth trying to have an overview of these different explanations. The first one is the technological diversity. Okay? Partly in a world where there's significant technological changes, think about information technology, for example, it may happen that a firm has to adapt. You know, in the traditional approach in industrial organization, you have a choice and you decide one technology that is the best. Okay? Well, what happens if you have 2 or 3 different technologies at some point in time, and it's not clear which one is the one that fits better with the kind of activities and the type of transaction you want to organize? Well, it may happen that these technologies will command different modes of organization. Okay, more or less centralized, for example. So you may have simultaneously a plant that will have an equipment that is adopting a certain technology, and you outsource other activities because this is another technology, you don't know exactly the performance of the technology, and so forth. Okay? Relatedly, path dependence can also be a factor. The firm has already adopted the technology, and therefore there are new technologies developing. So you maintain the old technology, for example, that is imposing a certain degree of concentration. Think about the steel industry, for example. But there are new technology, or the production of electricity with the gas turbine. There are new technologies that are developing, and you also want to take advantage of that, but that's a different mode of organization. So you have to combine combine the path dependence of what you have adopted as a technology already and the introduction of these new technologies. A second one, which is partially related, is the process of innovation. Well, the innovation, which can be innovation in process or innovation in product. And here we can view plural forms as a way to experiment new processes or new products. Okay? You want to initiate to market new products, for example, but you're not sure that it will work, or you think that it will work, but you're not sure that your partners will be convinced that it will work. So you experiment in-house to show to your partners, your franchisees, for example, that it can be successful. Okay? So it may be a way to diffuse innovation, the plural form, in that respect. Okay? You can try to trying to convince partners that they can, that this innovation can deliver profits. A third explanation, which is a favorite in the literature on franchising, is financial constraints. Okay? You're very entrepreneurial, you want to develop a new product, or you want to market that new product rapidly, and that would require very important investments, so you're confronted to financial constraints, and in order to overcome these financial constraints, well, you decide to do part of your activity in-house and to externalize other part of the activity. Typically, that's something that's been often argued in franchising, and it has been challenged, okay? Because most of the time, it's not a very convincing explanation according to the data that have been collected, including by Braddock and others. A fourth possible explanation is benchmarking, okay? Which is okay, for example, in franchising, but also, for example, in the car making industry, why is it that you maintain 20% of the activity outsourced while the rest is integrated? Well, that may be because it gives you a way to overcome asymmetric information, okay? So because you have outsider suppliers, then it gives you an idea of what are the costs, and it helps you checking your own internal costs and try to improve, adapt more efficient incentives and so forth. Or it may facilitate control problems, to solve control problems. You can argue with your employees or with the union, well, look, you know, these guys are producing exactly the same goods at the same quality, but at a lower price. It's because their costs are lower, and therefore you can, or because the organization of the production is different, and we should move towards a different organization. Okay, so that's benchmarking. And I would say, Sergio yesterday mentioned that very often we tend to neglect the analysis of power and influence. I think that, well, that's part of it, because if you have benchmarking, then it gives you power and bargaining, incentives, mechanisms, and so forth. Okay, so that's a fourth possible explanation. The fifth one is credible threat. Okay, if you maintain different forms of organization, well, you can put pressure on one side in order to be in a strong position. It's partially related to the previous one, in your negotiation, for example. So it reduces the risk of opportunistic behavior. Okay? My employees would like to have a strong increase in salaries, but I can show that, you know, the outsourcing suppliers are providing the same thing at a lower cost, and therefore the salaries are lower. Why do you ask more higher salaries? Okay? That can be in the employer-employee relationship, but it can also be, you know, between a franchisor and a franchisee. You know, the franchisee would like to pay less royalties, but in-house you show, well, the sales are increasing rapidly, and therefore you should expect to make a lot of profits, so why don't you want to pay these royalties? You know, it gives you, and if you don't pay the royalties, I'm going to kick you out and ask someone else to another store to do the job. Okay? And relatedly, it can be a buffer strategy if you invest in very specific assets. You know, that's very similar. It's also a way to having a buffer to adjust to market fluctuations or to change in the production process can also improve your credible threat if partners don't behave the way you want them to behave. A fourth, no, it's not fourth, it's sixth explanation, which is less developed, but my friends in Sao Paulo want to develop that, and I think there's something there, and some other people are trying to do that, which is a sort of knowledge-based view, okay? In diversifying the arrangements, in choosing different modes of organization simultaneously, it allows you to learn from alternative forms, either learn in terms of efficient organizations or learn in terms of efficient technology and so forth. So it's a learning process that pushes you, partly if you're in a sector of activity where there's a lot of changes in the technology, you may want to have that kind of possibility so as to learn more rapidly and benefit from the experience of the others without taking too much risk. So you're reducing your risk and improving your capacity to learn. Okay, if we wrap it up, so that's basically, I think, the main explanations that we find, and you can see that it's a diversity, but all in all, if you look at very often there are ad hoc explanations, but if you try to understand the logic behind these ad hoc explanations, I think that there are mainly two leading frameworks behind this variety when it comes to, if you look at the empirical investigation, for example. First, there's one which is coming out of agency theory, which is mostly focusing about problems of control and incentives. So, you know, if you look at the different explanations that I've mentioned, benchmarking and so forth, you can relate that to an agency problem. Okay? And the other leading explanation is, of course, transaction cost economics, which is looking for an efficient alignment, but is confronted to the problems of if there's one efficient alignment between the mode of organization and the type of transaction, why is it that we have these plural forms? And then you look at, well, it may be because You lower transaction costs if, for example, you're confronted to new technologies and you don't want to adopt these technologies immediately because the transaction cost can be too high. Then you reduce your transaction cost in diversifying your sources. Okay? So that can be related partially to transaction cost economics. So basically, the framework that I would like to develop is mostly related to the second one, although some aspect of the second one, in my view, can be introduced in that approach. But I will propose something that is a relatively substantial revision of the traditional approach in transaction cost economics. Okay? Starting with a model that you're familiar with, which is the model that most of you at least are familiar with that model, I think, which is the one that Williamson introduced in 1991. It is a paper from 1991 and revised in the book from 1996, Mechanisms of Governance, where he tried to model, based on the diversity of assets and the degree of specificity of these assets, he tried to model the three big families, right? So we are in the second puzzle here in that model. The second puzzle being we have alternative forms, and why is it that we don't choose only between markets and hierarchies, but also there's a third family in between, okay? And a short reminder for those of you who are not familiar with the model. So the idea was, okay, well, there are different degrees of specificity of assets or specific investments required to deliver a certain product or to deliver a certain activity, to organize a certain transaction. And related to that, there's a cost of governance, okay? And the idea is that, well, the more specific an asset is, the more there are contractual hazards. There are risks that you're taking when you're increasing the degree of specific asset, because you cannot use that to do other activities. And therefore, depending on the type of structure, the cost of governance will increase. More rapidly on markets, because there's a coordination problem. When the investments are very specific, then it may be advantageous to integrate because you want to protect yourself from opportunistic behavior from independent partners, so you integrate. Okay? The classical example of General Motors and Fisher Buddy, although this has been challenged. And then in between, well, in between you have a big question mark. Okay, this would be sort of intermediary degree of specificity of asset. But that's the area that is of interest for us, right? Because we're not talking about market relationships nor about integration. We're talking about this area here. And why is it that we have different arrangements that are possible here? Okay. I am changing a bit the model, and first in changing a bit the horizontal axis, the abscissa, substituting the benefits of coordination to specificity of assets, which is just a generalization, actually, of the three variables that Williamson took into account. The specificity of investments or specificity of assets, the frequency of a transaction, and the uncertainty that relates to that transaction, okay? And in a discussion with Ben McLeod, we reached that idea that, well, maybe it's better to talk about benefits of coordination and control rather than only taking into account one variable. That's a more general reasoning, okay? So I'm going to talk about the benefits of coordination and control, and I'm going to try to see what are the sources of differentiation in the hybrid area. And I would like to introduce basically three possible components that could explain the variety of forms, and that could sort of encapsulate what we've seen before in the explanation, but into a unified theoretical framework. First, the ambiguity in the degree of specificity of investments, and therefore the benefits of coordination that are related to these investments. And I will come back to what I mean by ambiguity and show that briefly in a model. Secondly, another possibility is the strategy of leading partners to reap the benefits of coordination. And a third possible factor could be the complexity of certain transactions that create uncertainties about the adequate mode of organization. Okay? So basically, you can relate that actually to the standard variables that are considered in most empirical tests based on transaction cost economics. but it covers something different, as you will see in the model, in that it tries to push a little further the explanation of the different forms that you can find under the general label of hybrid arrangements. First, ambiguity in the specificity of investments and the resulting benefits. Well, the idea here is that there are situations where investments, the type of investment you're making, are creating ambiguities about what would be the most adequate mode of organization to monitor these investments, okay? Think about consumers' cooperatives or producers' cooperative, for example. And let me illustrate that with the model, okay? In the model that Williamson introduced, you had these intersection of curves, okay, which correspond to a certain level of investments or the level of uncertainties, and therefore to some levels of benefits of coordination and control, okay? Now, when you're here, for example, at the intersection between markets and hybrids, what does it mean? Well, it means that I'm making investments, and because of the characteristic of these investments, it's not clear if it's better to have them provided by an outsider, an outside supplier, or if it's better to have it through a tight cooperation to a set of contracts that I will have with a specific subset of suppliers. So I can either go through the market, or I can decide to deal only with specific suppliers that I'm selecting because I think that, well, the investments are such that I want to protect myself against the risk of opportunistic behavior from my partners, okay? So that's why I talk about ambiguity. It's the same here, okay? Here it's a situation where we have much more benefit to expect from specific investments and benefits of coordination to overcome uncertainty problems or to control the organization of the production related to these investments. And again, there's an ambiguity here because, you know, well, you're so close to a situation where it may be better to maintain outside suppliers, but outside suppliers that are pretty close to integration. It's the Toyota model. Okay, the first-rank outsource suppliers. So the suppliers are very closely related to Toyota, to long-term interactions, although the contracts are short terms, but it's not an arm-length relationship. It's not a market relationship. It's really a network of suppliers that are closely related, and you could integrate. You know, it's ambiguous. You could integrate, and some firms with the same technology will decide to integrate. General Motors decided to integrate, while another, Toyota, decided to have a very tight network of first-rank suppliers in which Toyota has some shares so that they can control and take advantage of the control that they can exert on these suppliers, but they remain independent suppliers in last resort. So that's the first possibility, right? Which is close to the traditional explanation of the trade-off between the different forms, but it introduced the possibility that we have simultaneously two different forms with the same type of transaction. It may be advantageous for one firm to decide, well, I'll have some outside suppliers that are in a market, in arm's length relationship, and at the same time I have other suppliers that I'm connected with through relatively well-defined contracts and stable relationship over time. In the pharmaceutical industry, for example, you have often that kind of situation, or for the provision of services in the airline industry, for example, okay? Okay, so that's one possibility, but it's a form of, it's a situation of plural form. A second possibility within the same model, you will see that it's within the same model. Here we have a strategy of a driver. You have a leading party, it shouldn't be a partner, it's a leading party that has to overcome control problems. So you have the benefits of outsourcing, the benefits of coordination, or the benefits of controlling the investments or reducing the uncertainty are significant, but in order to do that, you have to overcome control problems. You have to have strategy towards your partners that will allow you to control, for example, the incentive problems and to reap benefits of coordination. Typically, this is what happens in dual distribution and franchising. Okay? You can use your in-house outlet to check, how it works, what are the possible benefits and so forth, to have a control over your franchisees, sorry. And the other way around, the franchisees are providing information about performance, about the behavior of employees and so forth that helps the franchisor to better control and take advantage of the situation in its own activities, okay? The same in the car-making industry. That could be the explanation of the buffer segment of the activity in the car-making industry. You outsource part of your activity, but you integrate other part of your activity so as to have a control mechanism between the different forms. It's a strategy of control. So basically here, what do we have? Well, we have a certain level of investment, okay? And therefore a certain or a level of uncertainty related to these type of investment, the type of technology, for example, with benefits of coordination and control. And facing these difficulties, let's think about benefits of coordination that are submitted to relatively high uncertainty in the efficiency of the technology you have chosen. Okay, that would be a good example. Okay, it happens, for example, in the airline industry. Do you choose the Dreamliner or Airbus 380 or the coming new model of Airbus A350? Okay, you have to make a very difficult choice in terms of investment, and you may decide that, okay, I'm going to use arrangement. It's decentralized and it's renewable and so forth. And I may decide to have other arrangements where simultaneously, let's say I do that with the Dreamliner because there's a lot of uncertainties about the quality of the plane because it's been confronted to several problems. Airbus has a reputation that has been a bit better, although they've had problems with the A380. So with that form, I may decide a more centralized organization. I deal only with one or two suppliers. Okay? So simultaneously, I'm dealing with different forms, and it's a strategy. Okay? It helps me keeping control over the suppliers. So it's a strategic behavior. And the third possibility is complexity. You're dealing with very complex transactions, and these complex transactions are creating a lot of uncertainties about what is the adequate mode of organization for these transactions. Okay? It's not clear that you have a clear mode of organization. It challenges the alignment principle, the idea that there's one mode of organization that fits better with one type of investment, what level of investments or one level of coordination, okay, more or less centralized coordination. Two examples here, and that may create problems of reversibility. Okay, there's a risk that if I choose a certain type of investment in a certain mode of organization, only one, and I discover that it was not adequate, but then I'm trapped in path dependence situation, I cannot reverse the investment, okay? Think about two examples here. On the transportation sector, the introduction of information and communication technology in the trucking industry. Okay? Several empirical studies have shown that we have very ambiguous situation here. Why? Well, because the introduction of information technology, computers on board of trucks, means that on one hand, it's much easier to control what drivers are doing. Okay? You have a very strong possibility of knowing exactly what was their itinerary, how long it took for them to do that itinerary, even the quality of their driving, because you can measure the technical performance of the truck and so forth. So you have a way to control very tightly the truck driver. Okay? And to tell him, well, sorry, guys, so you solved the control problem because you can tell, hey, guy, you told me that it took you 2 hours to go from here to there. I checked your itinerary. There was no traffic jam. There was no problem with the truck. What's going on? You stopped visiting your friends and, you know, having a coffee and whatever, okay? So that's one possibility. But the other possibility that has been explored in the empirical literature recently on the trucking industry is that, okay, well, the first possibility pushes towards integration. Okay? Because you can control better, and therefore measure the performance of the truck drivers, have adequate incentives, and so forth. But the other possibility is that, well, because of that possibility to use the information technology to coordinate the truck drivers, it may be better to just outsource. You have independent truck drivers that you can coordinate easily, making sure that you don't use trucks that are empty to go from one place to the other to collect parcels and so forth, because you can outsource and coordinate all that, the needs of trucking transportation through the electronic system, okay? That's an incentive to decentralize, okay? Which means what in terms of another possibility, before switching to the model, another example would be marketing a new technology, okay? You can market you have a new technology, and you have a choice here because of the complexity. It's a new technology. You don't know exactly how it's going to work. You don't know how people are going to react to that technology, what's going to be the after-sale requirements and so forth. So you have two possibilities. Either you decide, well, I'm going to provide that new technology, that new product related to that new technology directly through my own outlets, or I'm going to have an open source sort of licensing easily so that the people will use my technology more and more, and I will prevail on the market because of that open strategy. Okay, so that's two different strategies. One is integrated, and the other is going through hybrid. I'm franchising very easily different outlets so that they can diffuse my technology. Think about the development of the computer industry in the 1980s. There were these two different strategies that were adopted by different parties, okay? Which means what? Here we have a third situation, the complexity that creates uncertainties about adequate mode organization, where for the same type of investments and the same level of uncertainty, okay, you have a technology that is developing progressively. It's basically the same technology. Therefore, the benefits of coordination and the difficulties of control or the loss of benefits through to control problems are the same. So you're here. But there are two possibilities. One is you decide to integrate. I'm going to produce that product myself, so I don't need external suppliers, or I'm going to market that product through my own outlet, the initial strategy of Apple, for example. Okay. Or the other strategy, that was also the example of GVC versus VCR. The other possibility is, okay, well, I'm going to contract with partners, and they're going either to be my suppliers or to market my product, okay? So simultaneously here, for the reason of complexity, but technology is the same, I choose these two forms simultaneously, okay? In Williamson's view, that would be suboptimal because part of it, you're optimal if you're always remaining on the lower line because you're minimizing your cost of governance, okay? But because of the complexity of the transaction here, you cannot decide which one is going to be optimal, okay? So plural form may be a way to test which form is optimal. It's a way to try to explore, well, is it this one or this one that will allow me to penetrate the market more rapidly, to make more benefits, and so forth. Okay? So basically, that's the framework. Okay? The framework, the interesting part, I think, of that framework is that within the same theoretical framework, you're introducing the different dimensions, the different variables that I've mentioned previously. You can reinterpret all the 7 explanations within that unified framework with the central hardcore explanation. And we want to test, well, or if they agree with the model, we want to test that on several case studies that have been developed by the different parties to our team, or for some of them, they've been developed by researchers who are related with us, but are not part of the research project. So the basic idea is to check these hypotheses. Now that's the ongoing project, okay? So we just started identifying some of the sectors or some of the firms where these plural forms exist. So we're trying now to, and that's what we're going to do in the coming days, part of what we're going to do in the coming days in São Paulo, to try to identify more specifically different activities that could, and different firms that have endorsed plural forms of organization and that could relate to these three components: ambiguity, strategy, and complexity. We have already identified some of them. Paulo is signaling me that I'm running out of time. So, and it's good that I'm running out of time because precisely I don't have much to say because we're going to work on that in the coming days, right? So we started, for example, in identifying, like, for example, Carrefour in Brazil has adopted something like 4 different forms of marketing the products between his own stores. Some products that are transferred to subsidiary or to independent sellers, but there's even, it's the case of Danone, I think, and with also independent sellers, even door-to-door sellers. So you have many different forms at the same time that are adopted. The same, you developed yesterday the example of Corinne, so Danone, yes. It's not mentioned here, it's Danone, the example I gave. We have a similar example that Emmanuel developed some time ago, and we're working now on a paper about that, which is a group of French millers, where, again, the same millers are, on one hand, part of a network that is imposing very strict rules with a strict mode of governance, with a strategic center that is coordinating part of their activities, but at the same time, these millers are competing. They're providing flour to independently from the network to restaurants, to pizzerias, and so forth. So they have 2 different activities on one segment where they're competing, and the other part of their activity they are coordinating. It's another example of plural form. So we're trying to identify these case studies where, unfortunately, at this point, we can only work on, or mainly work on case studies. We would like to have more quantitative data, but that's probably a next step, right? So we have to start somewhere. Okay, conclusion, some key issues. Well, it's puzzling that we have that degree of dependence that is accepted by, in plural forms, what you have is a certain degree of dependence that is accepted, okay, by parties over both their property rights and their decision rights. So on one hand, because it's a plural form, they remain independent, and on the other hand, for some segment of their activities, for the same transaction, they're sharing and they're accepting a level of dependence, okay? So why is it? We have to clarify that. The expected returns, what are the risks at stake? What is the role of these risks? And what are the sharing rules that are adopted in these plural forms? These are some key issues. The value added of our contribution, we hope, at least, is that, well, we know a lot about the diversity of markets and how they work. Okay? For example, the different mechanisms of auction that have been developed in the reform of the network industries and infrastructure sectors. We know that there are, for example, different types of auctions, so there are different modes of markets that are different types of markets. We know also quite a lot, although less, about the diversity of integrated organization and how they work. You know, in the Chandler tradition, we know that there are different forms of integration, from the multi-functional firms to the multidivisional firm, functional firms, and so forth. Aoki also contributed to that. But we know very little about the diversity of hybrids, their structure of governance, and what allowed them to persist over time, okay? And one issue that may connect partially to what we've discussed also here in other sessions is that, well, if these forms are efficient, if they persist over time, and even if they tend to develop, then there may be a connection between that micro level and the macro level, factors of growth, and what are there institutional factors that are favorable to the development of these forms, and so forth. You know, is there a regulation that is more favorable to these forms and support their development and therefore facilitates their role in supporting growth and, you know, developing new sectors of activities, facilitating innovation, and so forth. So there are a lot of problems that are underlying here. We're not going to deal with all that. At this point, we're just trying to make some steps in this direction. And again, this is a work in progress. So for those who are interested, welcome on board. If you have ideas to work on some of these issues, particularly the young ones, because this is the future, do not hesitate to contact us. And for all of you, even those who don't want to be on board, thank you for your attention and partly for your questions and suggestions. Thanks a lot.
Well, we have room for discussion. Sergio?
Thanks, Claude, for the presentation. I was also wondering, your explanations, especially ambiguity and perhaps complexity, that there's this fuzzy area where you don't know the level of asset specificity. This may help explain plural forms, but it can also explain what actually Sandro is doing research on that, which is the vacillation of organizational forms. So one firm integrates, and then all of a sudden, after 5 years, it outsources a certain activity, then 5 years later, reintegrates the activity. It seems to me that the same argument would explain this phenomenon, yeah, equally, actually. And I wonder whether we actually should come up with another type of explanation that will account of taking into account why firms would actually stick with two forms at the same time rather than vacillating between alternative forms over time, because that may be another way to deal with this ambiguity issue.
Well, that's exactly my point. Maybe you can have another explanations for using plural forms. One explanation I'm developing right now is, well, since it's a quite fuzzy area, I don't know where I am, where I am, in which part of the curve I am, which is my asset specificity level. Since I don't know where I am, what I do, I look around and do what my neighbor is doing. So it's a kind of isomorphism. So what I'm trying to do is, well, like, let's look at the sociological institutionalism, and in order to mitigate risks, I take a look, what's going on out there. So if the agent's risk averse, they prefer choose several contractual arrangements or plural forms, whatever the name, in order to mitigate risk. So probably you can add some isomorphism, theoretical background for explaining this, just a guess. Another question is what seems to me is an interesting value, Claude, is try to identify what determines the choice. Thinking about public service provision, we have lots of ways of organizing prison services. We have outsourcing, we have public-private partnerships, we have privatization or traditional public provision. What determines the choice? What's the drivers for choice? So it's interesting value. We can discuss later because it can be a common project in the future.
I will change a little bit from ambiguity to strategy. And you interpret strategy as a way to face control problems. But also within strategy, you could address the segmentation strategy. So a firm deals with different segments of markets as a strategy. So explores different segmentations or differentiation of products. And this could require different specificities of the suppliers of this specific segment. So this competition strategy of the company could drive it is very traditional, but as you don't have only one market, only one product that you are doing, but your strategy segments the markets. So could explain not only governance that changes along the way, as they are suggesting. So you learn which one will have a better performance, and then you converge to you go, and you never, yeah. So, but anyway, you don't have a stable one yet. And but if you have segmentation, then I come from ambiguity to strategy, maybe you can explain to have two governances.
But segmentation goes back to Manuel's criticism that if you have segmentation, then you have heterogeneity of assets, perhaps, in each transaction. So you're not explaining a plural form, because for the, say, the premium market, you always choose vertical integration. So if you say, no, my transaction is a premium transaction, therefore you don't have plural forms for that transaction.
How can you avoid the conclusion that everything is a plural form? In which case, you know, it includes everything, so it doesn't make a demarcation. On the grounds that you reasonably make a distinction between legal contract, hierarchy, and relational contracting in a Williamson framework, but we never get that in a pure form, okay? Because of uncertainty and limited information and complexity, any legal contract is imperfectly specified and incompletely specified, all of them, okay? So in legal contracting, we always rely on other things, like relational issues, culture, norms, customs, all these sort of things. In hierarchy, no manager can know exactly what's going on and give perfect orders to someone to tell them what to do. So you rely on give and take, tradition, internal social things. So there's never pure hierarchy. There's never pure legal forms. So everything is a plural form.
Thank you. Well, there are questions and there are suggestions. So, you know, I view many of the things that have been mentioned as suggestions. So, thanks for all for that. Just for example, the discussion between what Sergio mentioned and, you know, well, yes, here, for example, if you're the ambiguity variable, okay? So you can have either that situation where you choose to combine two modes of organization simultaneously, so you have plural forms, or you may, and that would be a different problem, a different issue, although it can be in the same framework, you can hesitate between one or the other, and you're versatile, you know? You don't know exactly, so for a while you favor, you know, a market relationship with your suppliers, and then it doesn't work that well, so you switch to something else, and you previously outsourced, and now you want to have tighter control over your suppliers and so forth. So but the interesting thing is, I think that we can look at both aspects within the same theoretical framework, okay? And that's I think what is interesting compared to the different explanations that I've listed before, where they're relatively ad hoc explanations with, you know, different hypotheses each time. Here you have a sort of set of consistent hypothesis to check that. I think it's the same with, and I agree with you, you know, that there are complex forms. Of course, we're working on that together, so, so let's see. But that's next week. So we'll solve the problem there first and then the other one. The same for, well, I have to think about your comment about strategy. But my view here would be that, okay, strategy is a situation where, for example, yeah, the comment by Sergio was relevant. You know, if you're segmenting the market, then you have different types of contracts and therefore different transactions in technical terms. So it's not the same transaction, and therefore, so it's a strategy, but a strategy related to different transactions, and therefore different problems of coordination and control, because you're targeting different markets. Okay, so it's not exclusive, but now Jeff, yes, in the real world, things are complex. Okay, but from an analytical point of view, you need to have an approach where maybe there are not pure forms, but there are substantial differences. There's a substantial difference between General Motors that is making its input at the level of 80% in-house, and Toyota that is having its input delivered by outsourcing, but outside suppliers at a level of 80%. Okay? So the organizational arrangement is not pure, it's 80%, but these are two modes of organization that are substantially different with different types of contracts. One is the dominating contract in General Motors is the contract with the employees, and the few suppliers are outsiders. In Toyota, the main contracts are the contracts with the suppliers. So you have different types of contracts and so forth. The trucking industry, you know, Smith Transportation in the US, it was a totally integrated firm, a hierarchical firm. Truck drivers are employees, and the headquarters is deciding who is going to go where, at what time in the day, and so forth. And a network of independent, like Déménageurs Bretons, let's say in France, where you have independent truckers that are coordinating through an internet system so that, you know, they're coming from Brittany, so they will deliver in Paris, but if the good is to be delivered in Marseille, they coordinate with another truck driver that will drive to Marseille because that's his itinerary. It's a totally different pattern. So yes, you know, things are complex in the real world, but they are analytically, they're different, and we have to understand these differences, in my view. No, I think that... Sorry?
I think the definition of fluoroform that you are using is different from what
Yeah. Well, Smith Transportation, it was a purely hierarchical. They have their own trucks. They didn't deal with independent truckers. They had their own truck. They decided the itinerary. By the way, they were owned by a community of religious community. Okay, so grise. So, but they were totally integrated. Maybe because they were coming from the Catholic tradition, you know, of a very hierarchical system. But it's totally integrated. They don't deal with any outside trucker. All the truckers are working for the company, and the company is deciding and negotiating the contract with them and so forth, which is totally different from, again, from Déménageurs Bretons, where you have independent truckers that coordinate themselves through a technology, a technological support. Okay? So these are, in a sense, yes, almost pure forms. Yeah. Well, yes, in the real world, things are complex. I'm sorry for that. But if you're dealing only with complexity, you don't go anywhere, right? So you have to, yeah, to look at the core of the activity if you want to understand what's going on.
Very interesting. I like this, the way it sets it up and have the framework, and then you can test everything. But I was just wondering in microeconomics, every time we see a graph like this, and then a typical economist will ask, well, what if the curves aren't all nicely, if you have non-convexities? Would that be possible if you had like the hybrids curve, it grow, I don't know for what reason, but it go up, and then for a certain, then it go down, and then you'd have all these different, for the same, very different firms doing the same thing in different areas.
Any other question? Well, I will add my question. But first, just a very small comment. I would prefer the benefits from control than the benefits from coordination, because you can have autonomous coordination by the market and may play the role of coordination very well. Perhaps cooperative coordination is better than just coordination. But my major point is the following. You chose to keep the transaction as the unit of analysis. So you chose to keep the transaction as the unit of analysis. Maybe you are incorporated, perhaps implicitly, the features of the agents, of the firms, like the strategy of the agents, who is the driver. So it's a feature of the firm of the agent in the framework. So it's not only the unit of analysis, the transaction. But what I thought when I saw the problem of plural forms, perhaps is the benefit of changing the unit of analysis from the transaction for a set of transactions. Because a company has a set of transactions. And then if you have this unit of analysis, you can explore the interaction and the synergies from, or let's say the externalities, effects from one transaction to the other transaction. And this may be helpful to understand some plural forms arrangements. And the second comment is when you talk about complexity, And you mentioned path dependence, and so I will not reproduce your whole argument, okay? But I will add another suggestion, submit that path dependence may be important in a different context. If you have attributes of the transaction at a certain point, and this requires a particular governance structure, for example, hierarchy, and then the conditions of the environment change, and then the transaction attributes are different, and then you have a different choice, for example, a contract. But you are already committed with some transactions with the hierarchical form. Due to path dependency, you continue this relationship, but the new relationships are using contracts. So you may have a plural form because of path dependence, so you have an increasing return in your former transaction, so you're not going to change that transaction. But it's different, I guess, from complexity. Is path dependence mainly, which is causing the plural forms arrangement that we observe in a certain moment of time.
Just the last point, no, it's not necessarily different because the complexity may come out from the fact that you are dealing with two different technologies at the same time. And one where you're path dependent, you know, ADF is producing electricity with nuclear plants and with traditional hydroelectric power, but now they have introduced these new technologies of gas turbine, and it's much more efficient to have these gas turbine monitored by independent suppliers, okay, for different reasons that we don't have to discuss now. But so it's not necessarily incompatible. Otherwise, the comment by Bernardo, which I think falls into the same category as yours about the set of transactions, in the sense that my answer to that is that, yes, you're correct. You know, we have nice curves, and they may not always be that nice, and then that may explain also why either at a certain point in time or over time, you will switch from one arrangement to the other. And similarly, you know, yes, transactions are not isolated. They are very often interdependent transactions, and therefore you have to deal often with a set of transactions. But the point is, and maybe that relates partially to also to Jeff's comments, from an analytical point of view, maybe it's because of my previous previous life in microeconomics, you know, from an analytical point of view, you have to start with a model that is relatively simple and try to push it as much as possible to see what you can explain. And both in the development of the model and in the collection of empirical data, progressively you can sophisticate the model. So I would say that it's more a methodological issue. I agree with these comments. It's just that, you know, I don't know yet, and I don't know any paper that have been able to deal with a clear strategy with a set of transactions simultaneously. We know that very often transactions are interdependent, but how do you deal with that from an analytical point of view? It's like, yeah, making assumptions about the behavior of agents, you know, to simplify, because that's where we are. So that would be my answer. But I agree, you know, that we have to be aware of that, and both at the theoretical level, if we can push the models in that direction, it's much better. And at the empirical level, well, hopefully the empirical data will progressively help us, you know, complexifying the model. I know it's not a satisfying answer, but that's how we work, right? All of us.
Thank you, Claude. Let us give a hand to Claude.
Pleasure to start this plenary 4, Knowledge Governance, with the panelists, Professor Francisco Teixeira and Professor Jorge Ávila. Jorge Ávila is the president of the Patent Office, the Brazilian Patent Office, and also professor at the university, right here, Federal University, Unirio, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, the state of Rio de Janeiro. It's a federal university, but it's not the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. The Federal University of the state of Rio de Janeiro, it's also here in the same neighborhood, it's just at the side. And so, as Professor Jorge Ávila has to leave us earlier, so I give the word for him. And thank him. very much to come.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Anna. It's a pleasure to talk to everybody. I'll make a very short speech on how we have been dealing with this issue of knowledge governance in Brazil since many years, and what are the perspectives I think we have in mind, and what's going on. I think things are changing very quickly, and this is something which has to be paid attention to. Indeed, Brazil has always been against any kind of global governance on knowledge. This is the basic, if we would resume in one sentence, what has been the positioning of Brazilian representatives in the fora where knowledge governance has been discussed since very long. It's been a long tradition of opposing to any kind of international ruling on knowledge governance. It's not by chance that many times in the WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization, Brazil has opposed the creation of several treaties, has always been against the celebration of new global norms. And the basic argument has always been the argument that different countries in different stages of development should have the right to organize the way they deal with knowledge in a way which is compatible to their needs, and their needs being different from the needs of other countries in different stages of development. There would not be any possibility of a treaty which would establish a set of norms which could be good for everybody. Under this understanding, Brazil has blocked recently the negotiations of the SPLT, which is the Substantive Patent Law Treaty. Brazil has also opposed to the clauses of IP in the Mercosur-European Union Treaty, has opposed to the IP clauses in the ALCA, the AFTA Treaty, and has had in various fora a positioning which has been more or less always the same. This has been changing, I think, in the last few years. I think that the architecture of the international IP system has been changing. Indeed, since 2005, we started in WIPO a discussion on what we called a discussion on development agenda for WIPO, which tried somehow to establish more clearly what are the links of the international norm setting in IP to the development strategies and to development goals set by the United Nations entities. I think the discussions were very fruitful. We could understand much more in depth what were the issues under discussion. And I think that it was really, the discussions organized in two polar views in the beginning. One was this traditional Brazilian view, which was similar to the views of other developing countries, India, many Arab countries, many African countries, many East Asian and West Asian countries also had the same understanding that the IP system was being normatized, was being ruled with the purpose of benefiting those who had arrived early to the innovation arena. And so the basic proposition of the development agenda was to establish a more equitative, how could I say, a more equitative framework for the norm setting regarding knowledge, governance, and IP. I think that the discussions which began very polarly organized with the Group B countries, the rich countries in one side and the developing countries in the other side, this could converge after a few years to a more equilibrated understanding of the role of IP. WIPO was redesigned in this process. WIPO now has a very important division which is oriented to the promotion of growth, economics, which was something, it was a discipline which was not very frequently addressed in the WIPO, has now become a division in WIPO. They have a chief economist, and they have a series of studies which are organized regularly in order to approach the economic impact of the international norm setting in governance, in knowledge governance and IP. And I think that the result of all this is that we have been able to understand both sides, developing countries and developed world, a little bit more deeply, how innovation networks organize throughout the world, and what's the role that knowledge governance can play in the organization of this production of innovation, and what's of particular interest to developing countries on the participation of newcomers to the innovation-oriented networks. I foresee a system which was being designed to be unipolar. There was a trilateral which was composed essentially by the patent offices of the United States, Europe, and Japan, which in some moment in the beginning of these discussions, in the beginning of the 20th century, and in the beginning of the SPLT discussions, were designed to somehow become the only one pole for decisions regarding appropriability of knowledge. I think that this scenery is totally overpassed. I think that what's now under construction clearly is a much decentralized system with the several regions of the world somehow collaborating among themselves and inter themselves. So what we have seen nowadays in the international IP scenario is the consolidation of regional consortia among the patent offices of small groups of countries to 20. The European patent office is, of course, the congregation of a bigger number of countries, 42. And these regional consortia are building strong links among themselves. And we are figuring out ways to establish a collaborative way of granting intellectual property rights, which does not give excessive privilege to those who have arrived earlier. So the genuine intent is to create local capacity in the developing countries and even in the less developed countries, in order for these countries to be able to have their own companies building IP portfolios, which would allow them to participate in a regular market-oriented, contract-based, IP-based innovation, open innovation system, which seems to be the basic paradigm of the production of knowledge in the coming years. So having said this, I think it's enough for beginning the discussions. Thank you.
Now, please, Francisco.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here in this very interesting workshop. And thank you, Sandro and Anastasia, for the invitation. And my main objective here today is to raise two interrelated points present in the current social situation that, in my opinion, deserve to be part of the institutionalism research agenda. The first point is related to the current form of political representation, institutionalized and organized around the concept of a representative democracy. I would like to point out that representative democracy, highly influenced by the liberal tradition, functions based on a pyramidal hierarchical structure of political representation. The hierarchy has, on one hand, the parties as one of its main agents, and on the other hand, occupying the highest post in this hierarchy, the elected representatives, both to the parliament and to the executive. It's important to notice that in these systems, the voters are called to choose candidates from a list built by the parties in internal processes that are not open to a wide participation participation or scrutiny in most cases. I'm not saying nothing new, because for a long time, the problems of these systems of political representation have been debated. The main criticism sustained that the traditional parts are not able to represent diffuse interests of an ever-changing and complex society anymore. The parties would not be prepared to represent, for example, the interests of diverse minorities such as Greens, feminists, and others. As a consequence, today's political movements, which are mobilize large amounts of people, are occurring outside the realm of parties or other traditional political instances, like trade unions, for instance. I'm not a political scientist, and therefore, I'm not prepared to elaborate on that. However, for me, it's very clear that the political representative systems simply could not cope with the rapid change. And it's worth remembering that capitalism, more than a system of resource allocation and income distribution, is a system of governance. Alongside all this, we witnessed the surge and rapid diffusion of the internet, and recently, within the internet, a new set of tools that are being called Web 2.0. I'm referring to the emergence of the social medias, the so-called social medias in general. I'm referring to Kaplan and Halley's definition of social media as a group of internet-based applications that built on the ideological and technological foundations of Web 2.0, and that allow the creation and exchange of user-generated content. My point is, the Web 2.0 and social media is contributing in a new and powerful way to increasingly challenge the so-called representative democracy. It's very important to mention that by saying this, I'm not suggesting any kind of technological determinism. On the contrary, at first, I highlight the social change that exacerbated the problems presently faced by the liberal democracy. What I'm trying to stress is that social media and other Web 2.0 tools have enormous potential to serve as a way for showing discontentment and expressing interests that cannot be addressed by the traditional political order anymore. Remember that these tools are being used not only in the Arab Spring, which is not a good example here since those countries didn't have liberal democracies in place. However, these Arab countries had a highly hierarchical and authoritarian political system. Besides, Web 2.0 tools can be found in recent movements in countries like Spain, Italy, and Chile that have representative democracies. In Brazil, the use of social media for organizing political manifestations has not succeeded so far. There is the suspicion that the existing attempts were linked to parties or even motivated by press interests. If this is the case, it confirms that what is regarded to be one of the main characteristics of the new tools. They are not prone to centralized command. The organizational structure of these new movements is based on the principle of decentralized emergency. That is, these structures are spontaneously created. The principle that makes these social tools so potentially powerful is very simple. The new tools permit communication from many to many in real time at the same time, which is totally different from one-to-one communication or one-to-many, as, for example, in emails. Although simple, This principle is so powerful because it tends to remove all barriers to communication and expression. It's possible to make an analogy between this possible scenario and the Greek agora. We now can have a virtual electronic agora, but it is only an analogy. The important point is that the pyramidal hierarchical system of representation is now being counterpointed by organized movement from outside the traditional political system. And Web 2.0 is helping it. The second and interrelated point that I'd like to raise is that Web 2.0 is also contributing for challenging the organizational reality. More specifically, what is potentially in check here is also the pyramidal and hierarchical structure of the ever-growing capitalist companies. It's important to remember that pyramidal hierarchy is a form of governance based on control. One of the main means of control inside a hierarchy is control over the information flow. It's common sense that in bureaucratic hierarchies, information means power. In this vein, it's possible to trace in the flux of information the nodes of power and vice versa. The problems and pitfalls of this type of governance structure based on hierarchy and personal control have been appointed and debated for a long time, nothing new again. In short, many authors believe that the bureaucratic hierarchical structure is not suitable for new requirements of competitiveness. That's to say flexibility, agility, and responsiveness. However, in spite of all criticism, governance based on extensive hierarchy seems quite safe. Again, Web 2.0 tools have the potential to change this situation. As already mentioned, these tools interfere exactly in the way information flows within society through new forms of communication and within organizations as well. I would like to stress that with Web 2.0, information and communication do not flow exclusively through the boxes that conform a hierarchy anymore. It's perfectly possible for works to independently establish completely different patterns of communication ties, both inside and outside an organization. These possibilities means that the old form of governance can lose its most important form of control over the workforce. At first view, this possible change may look minor and incapable of challenging the traditional mode of organizational establishment. However, it is worth stressing that it potentially reduces drastically the information asymmetries inside a company. Maybe because of that, David Bullier, an important sociologist in the field of communal governance arrangement, has questioned the size of the firm in the future. According to him, it is likely that today's big firm be gradually substituted by flexible and atomized forms of doing business using Web 2.0 platforms. The fact is that social media is diffusing very quickly among companies around the world. So far, the main use has been in marketing. Companies are extremely worried about the possible and actual damages that discontent customers can do to their reputation and trademarks through social networks. However, I believe that the main contribution this tool can possibly make to companies is facilitating the cooperative process. In fact, the performance of complex activities necessary for high-value aggregation, as in innovation efforts, requires a high level of seamless cooperation among people inside and outside organizations. Therefore, in principle, companies should be interested in harvesting this potential for improving their business processes. Besides, these technological changes meet the new meaning attributed to work by the new generation, the so-called Y generation.